I've actually avoided talking about Steve Shives for a while now. I find him to be, well, annoying to say the least. There's nothing about him that's remotely entertaining, and he's made himself an SJW joke that isn't even worth laughing at. And that's what brings us here today. His shtick is just making up top 5 lists about everything under the sun. And he's made one about YouTube atheists that deserves to be examined. So, here goes. As a YouTube atheist, let's see what stupid thing Steve has come up with.
Yes, I'm a YouTube atheist, but try not to hold that against me, okay?
Oh, Steve, there are far, far, far more important things to hold against you, don't worry. But let's be honest, while you might be an atheist, that's not your bread and butter. You do not have an atheist channel, but we'll come back to that later.
Here are 5 toxic things about YouTube atheism.
Toxic only to someone like you, a fundamentalist SJW. They're certainly not toxic to anyone who's actually skeptical of irrational claims.
Number 1, it has a sexism problem.
No, it doesn't. You want to know who does have a sexism problem? Radical feminists like yourself.
Many of the most popular atheists on YouTube are brazen anti-feminists who insult and belittle women and men, but mostly women, who speak out against gender inequality.
Alright, let's break that down. First off, I'm not aware of anyone who attacks women. They attack feminism, which is not the same as attacking women. It's an attack on a bad idea. See, here's the thing, Steve. Atheists ought to be skeptics, not just of religion, but of everything. Now, granted, a lot of them are not, which is why we have so many of them out there that are incredulous SJWs. But atheists, and indeed all skeptics, are supposed to be critical of every position, to question all conventions, and to demand evidence and reason in all things. So when they look at feminism, they need to be critical of it because modern third and fourth wave feminism is a rational disaster. YouTube atheists are not attacking women. They're attacking a really, really, really bad ideology.
They also proudly deny the existences of things like the wage gap, rape culture, gender imbalances in political and cultural representation, and other problems that are widely accepted and seriously discussed outside of the misogynist circle jerk that is the atheist community on YouTube.
You mean all those things that have been completely and totally debunked, except within the irrational human centipede that is modern feminism and SJW stupidity? See, that's the thing. Skeptics, and I'm going to use that word instead of atheists because we're talking about more than just religion here, but skeptics question claims made without evidence and point out idiocy. All of these things you've mentioned here have been completely debunked. They're simply not true, except in the tiny little minds of SJWs that have an emotional attachment to the lies. All you're really doing is whining that reality is hurting your precious widow feelings. Fuck you, Steve!
But lest you think that sexism is the only form of bigotry running rampant in atheist spaces on YouTube, let me assure you, number 2, it also has a racism problem.
Which, of course, is still not true. And again, the biggest racists out there are, in fact, the SJWs who spend all their time whining about it. But that's not a surprise.
And it's the best kind of racism, too, the willfully oblivious kind.
How is it even possible to be willfully oblivious to racism? Because by definition, racism is prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior. If you think your own race is superior, how can you possibly be unaware of it?
One of the most subscribed to atheists on YouTube recently made videos espousing his views that, for example, Black Americans who speak out against racial injustice are part of a victim cult.
It's not just Black Americans, it's leftist Americans, because that's what modern American progressivism is. It's a giant victimhood circle jerk. No one is responsible for their own problems. It's always someone else's fault. But, reality. Don't let it get in the way of your ideology, Steve.
Or the displacement of black folks by gentrification isn't a problem because it results in nicer neighborhoods with fewer thugs hanging around.
Exactly what are black votes? Are you trying to say that black people all vote a certain way? Maybe because they're not smart enough to think for themselves? Because that kind of thinking is blatantly racist. You racist?
Or, my personal favorite, the true outrage isn't racism, but people calling people like him racists. Because why would anyone think that the white guy who makes a virtue out of publicly not giving a shit about black people was a racist? It's ridiculous.
Now, we all know he's talking about TJ, and frankly, I am not now, nor have I ever been a fan. But in this instance, TJ is right. Regressives use words like racist and sexist and misogynist and all that like clubs to shut down legitimate conversation and criticism of their positions. If you're saying something they don't like, they call you names and insult you so they can pretend that you're scum not worthy of talking to. Mostly because they've got nothing intelligent to say on the subject in the first place.
Hang on, I'm not done. Number 3, it has a religious bigotry problem too.
But only when we're talking about Islam. When YouTube atheists are attacking white Christians, that's A-okay.
The ugliest religious bigotry in the YouTube atheist community is, of course, directed at Muslims, who are commonly stereotyped as potential terrorists and whose religion is viewed as inherently worse and more dangerous than any other.
Huh. How many terrorist attacks are carried out by Buddhists again? Or Hindus, which granted is not a non-zero number? Or Christians, which again is not a non-zero number? That certainly doesn't come anywhere close to the thousands upon thousands upon thousands of attacks carried out by radical Muslims. How exactly is this criticism of Islam unjustified again? I don't get it.
But there's still plenty of judgmental condescension left over for Christians and religious folks in general. Many YouTube atheists will still cite belief in God as evidence of mental illness, thus denigrating religious folks and the mentally ill at the same time.
Mental illness? Probably not. Delusion? Absolutely. But as I've pointed out before, delusion is defined as an idiosyncratic belief or impression that is firmly maintained despite being contradicted by what is generally accepted as reality or rational argument, typically a symptom of mental disorder. So what fits that definition? Let me think.
Not that they give a shit.
No, we just don't give a shit. Why should we? Because our arguments are not based on carrying our overblown emotions around on our sleeves like yours are. Reality doesn't change because you desperately want to be politically correct. And you know something? The best way to get people the help they so desperately need is to properly diagnose them. So if religious people are delusional, as they clearly are, if they have mental problems, which some clearly do, how is it insulting to point this out?
Pushing the religious into the mud and then pointing and laughing at them is one of YouTube atheism's most treasured pastimes. That might be why, number 4, it's addicted to drama and conflict.
Some are, granted, but his is social media, and the whole format is addicted to drama and conflict. That's one reason I really don't care for it, because I don't care about drama and conflict, I care about truth. And that's something Steve wouldn't know if it ran him over.
Some of the most watched atheists on YouTube today began making videos in response to creationists. Some of them conducted themselves with class, dignity, and intellectual honesty, striving to have civil conversations with often exasperating adversaries.
And the reason that a lot of those people changed, and I'm not saying it's a good thing, but the reason things changed is because their adversaries were so stupid. Now, I got started doing this back in the mid-'80s, long before YouTube or the internet, when people like Henry Morris and Dwayne Gish of the Institute for Creation Research were pushing to get creationism taught in public high school science classes. And I've debated a lot of these people, and I found that they cannot engage in intellectual discussion or debate because they're so emotionally consumed with their religious beliefs that they're incapable of questioning anything they believe, no matter how demonstrably absurd it is. They're not only completely blind to their own failings, They simply don't care. So yeah, I'm not overly nice to these people because they haven't earned my respect. Any more than you have, Steve.
But even back in those less fractious early years, before the community's pervasive racism and sexism surfaced, the most popular personalities were those who gleefully bullied their targets.
There is nothing bullying about pointing out where people are factually wrong. See, Steve, here's how a worthwhile debate is supposed to work. Two people come together and hash out the facts regarding their positions, presenting the strongest arguments they can, and in the end, one side wins out because it's the best supported position. And that doesn't happen with religion or indeed with any ideology. The theist comes with their fanatical beliefs and leaves with the same beliefs no matter how badly they lose the debate. They invariably lose every single solitary time. And they don't approach it to learn anything. They just want to preach. And that's why these debates are ultimately a waste of time. It's just like talking to regressives, because you all operate exactly the same way.
Small wonder then that once the creationist opponents had been exhausted, the bullies turned and found new enemies within atheist circles.
What are you talking about? There are still tons of them out there.
And it turns out that most people who enjoyed watching obnoxious white dudes attack Christians.
Notice how Steve is going full racist here, pointing out the race of the atheists, as though that has anything to do with anything. But people like Steve are just blinded to his own racism, sexism, and intolerance. Because it doesn't matter what race anyone is, except to SJWs who detest straight white men.
We're just as entertained by watching those same obnoxious white dudes attack women, Muslims, and racial justice activists.
You know, there's something that's just bizarre to me. You notice the one thing that Steve has never actually talked about in his 5 bad things about YouTube atheists? Atheism! He has never, ever, not even once, addressed attacking religion, except as it relates to his SJW beliefs. Instead, he's upset that atheists are attacking his emotionally driven leftist agenda. And he's pretending that because he's an atheist, he ought to get a pass. Not a chance, Steve. Not a chance.
That the YouTube atheist community is now dominated by professional trolls.
To be really honest, it's dominated by entertainers, because there's not really any debate going on, because the religious have no interest in debating. I find it's primarily about people talking at each other, not to each other. And that's kind of a limitation of the format, that people produce videos refuting someone else's video, and so on, and so on, and so on. There isn't a lot of live debate, especially not face-to-face debate. It's response videos. What do you expect to happen?
Who manufacture conflict in order to generate content and views would be bad enough if the damage they caused was confined to YouTube. But it's not.
Welcome to business. Again, I don't necessarily agree with it, but I certainly understand that this is how things work. Develop some realistic expectations and an honest view of the system.
Number 5, it reflects poorly on the rest of the atheist movement.
I really don't know that you can make a case for there being an atheist movement. Getting atheists to agree on much of anything outside of atheism is like herding cats. As I said earlier, atheism is supposed to be about being skeptical, but far too many atheists, like Steve here, are totally credulous when it comes to social issues. They believe what makes them feel good simply because it makes them feel good. And I have a serious problem with that.
Ever wonder why, with a few notable exceptions, YouTube atheists are not invited to address secular conferences or represent atheist organizations to the public?
Well, maybe because the vast majority of those so-called atheist conferences are just SJW fests in disguise. And that's the only reason that crap like Elevator Gate gets taken at all seriously.
If you're lucky, your first contact with atheism on YouTube came in the form of one of the more responsible voices, like Aaron Ra, Seth Andrews, or Matt Dillahunty.
Meaning people who agree with you. I don't actually like most of those people. I mean, I like Matt when he's speaking about atheism, but the second he goes full social justice warrior, count me the hell out.
But unfortunately, it's much more likely that before you got to them, you discovered one of the people I'm talking about in this video, one of the proudly offensive, cluelessly bigoted assholes who might as well be caricatures of atheists drawn by alarmist evangelists.
Meaning people who don't agree with you and who call you out on your ridiculous regressive bullshit. Because they're not signaling the right virtues. That's why things like Atheism Plus imploded, because you idiots kept eating your own whenever they didn't march to the tune of exactly the right piper.
We atheists like to pat ourselves on the back for being more reasonable than the religious folks, but I don't think that's true.
The only ones patting themselves on the back are you regressive retards. The rest of us are only interested in finding the truth, the best supported, the most intellectually valid, the most factually defensible truth. And we don't care how it makes us feel. We only care that it's true.
And judging by the most visible representatives of our movement on YouTube, the most unreasonable belief shared by many of us might be the belief that we're the reasonable ones.
Because you're not. That's why you're such a joke on YouTube, Steve. Everyone else knows that you and your kind are jackasses, and you just haven't gotten the memo. Instead of stepping back and reevaluating what you have to say, you hide in your safe spaces and scream how offended you are. Reality doesn't care about your offense, Steve. Rent a clue.
The hardest part is picking only 5.
You still haven't said a damn thing about actual atheism. Imagine that. He tries to criticize YouTube atheism and then spends all of his time whining about his social justice horse crap. Because newsflash for you, Steve, atheism has nothing at all to do with social justice. I mean, I know you'll find that hard to believe, but it's true. And that's the problem. We get all the people on the SJW side who desperately want to roll all of their disparate beliefs under a single umbrella and pretend that we've all got one big happy socially regressive family. But we don't. The second you start talking about things other than the rejection of belief in gods, you're no longer talking about atheism. So whether someone who disagrees with social justice nonsense is an atheist or not is entirely irrelevant, and you ought to know that. It's really unfortunate that you have no clue, but it isn't at all surprising, because people on the regressive left have an agenda. They hate the majority, and it doesn't matter if you're talking about a racial majority, or a religious majority, or a gender or sexual orientation majority. They hate anyone who has any kind of political or social power, mostly because it isn't them. They're supposedly for the little guy, but only so long as the little guy walks in lockstep with them. Otherwise, they just attack them and call them names and pretend to be the victim. They certainly can't defend their views intellectually. They've got no actual evidence to present. They can't step up and prove that their views have any actual validity. No, they can just cry and hide and pretend they're being oppressed. But they're not, and fewer people are falling for their whiny bullshit anymore. We don't care if you think we're being mean to you, Steve. Grow a pair and stop being a crybaby. If you actually care about atheism, be an atheist. Stop being an idiot wearing an atheist hat. Nobody is impressed by you. I'm sure you haven't learned that lesson, but God, I hope someday you will.